Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Welcome to Michael Brown Unplugged. Let's get started because I got a lot to talk about. And I was going to say that yesterday, on Wednesday, I got sucked into a debate with a troll on Twitter. But to be completely honest, no, I allowed myself to get sucked into it. So before anybody jumps down my throat about, well, you choose to do those things. Yes, I freely admit that I chose to allow myself to get sucked into a debate with a little twerp on Twitter. And this little twerp came out of nowhere because he is the one, at least he claims to be the one, that got my friend Bruce Carroll, who goes by @GayPatriot on Twitter, suspended, if not removed from Twitter permanently. I don't know which it's going to be yet. But anyway, to make a long story short, yesterday I told you that I'm hot and cold on Twitter. Well, yesterday it was a hot day, and I was wound up. I have to admit I was truly wound up. But I want to explain why. Because there is a part of me, and I think as you get older, I think as you get wiser, as you realize that there is a lot of dumbassery in the world, and you can either choose strategically where you're going to take your battles, or if you're going to engage in battle at all. And yesterday I was engaged in battle. And now I find myself almost 24 hours later still furious over the battle that I became engaged in. But before I go to the little twerp that somehow believes that, well, the old adage of sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never harm you, I don't think he's old enough to have ever heard that. And he was all upset about the use of the word tranny for a transvestite. Now, I got to tell you, in all honesty, when I saw that tweet, I had to go online to find out whether or not the use of the word tranny in describing a transvestite was politically correct or incorrect. Because that's the world we now live in. We now live in a world where you have to, we need George Orwell to come back, put his Newspeak dictionary online so that he can update it every 24 hours. Because those who want to control the language and those who want to choose to be offended by words that people use are truly the liberal fascists of the 21st century. I don't know. There was a time when it's almost like these words have an arc of acceptability and non-acceptability. Now, as you know, I think because I have such a large circle of friends, if I've got 5,000 friends, by the very nature of the number, a certain percentage of those friends are going to be homosexual. They're going to be gay. Now, homosexuals, that word used to carry a pejorative, and in some circles it still does. The use of the term homosexual to some people is a pejorative. That's fine. I am not the arbiter of modern English language. Homosexual is a legitimate word to describe people who engage in same sex as the sex of their gender, which, of course, now I've used the word gender, and Lord knows what that means, right? But with respect to homosexuals, they then take the word gay and they appropriate the word gay for themselves so that gay becomes the appropriate way to describe a homosexual. Now, when I was growing up, whether you think this is appropriate or not, and if you're offended by this, well, you know what? Call somebody that cares. There was a time when the use of the term queer was considered a pejorative with respect to people who were gay or homosexual. Then gay people, homosexuals, appropriated that word, and then queer. Now, and here's what I don't know. Here's what I truly don't know. Is it okay for me as a heterosexual to refer to my gay friends as queer? Or is it only acceptable for my gay friends to refer to themselves or their other gay friends as queer? Do you see how we have put ourselves in this pretzel regarding language? It is absurd what we're doing. Absolutely absurd. And let me say this before anybody goes off the deep end. I know that some words are hateful and some words are hurtful to other people. But guess what? While I try to remain sensitive to that, there is no humanly way possible to keep track of what is acceptable or not acceptable in today's modern culture. I go back to the description I told you in yesterday's podcast about the woman from the Good Hands Company, that when she was asking me a few questions about my birth date and then she asked me about my gender, I kind of laughed and said, well, today I'm male and tomorrow I'm, I don't know. And we both had a good laugh about it, which told me that she was only following a script that her employer had told her. Now, listen, you have to be sensitive when you're asking people about their gender. So when that happens, let's make certain that we don't say anything to offend anybody. That's how we're supposed to live our lives now? First, I don't know, and I'm not going to spend the time to decide what is offensive to somebody or not offensive to somebody. I am who I am, and I am going to speak the way I speak, and if people find it offensive, like I said, call somebody that cares. But here's the bigger danger in this entire mentality. Once you appropriate language, and once someone declares that they, or their group, is the arbiter of language, that is the proverbial foot in the door. That is the proverbial progressivism to eventually having the government become the arbiter of what is acceptable speech and what is not acceptable speech. And if you don't think, because I know some people right now, some people, maybe not you, but some people listening to this podcast, particularly if they've never heard me before, are thinking to themselves, oh, but Michael, that could never happen. It is absolutely impossible that government would ever step in and tell people what they can say or not say. Pregnant pause. Another pregnant pause. The pregnant pause is for those of you who know that indeed, even in 2019, there are governments that do that. The pregnant pause is to give time for the misinformed or the ignorant among us to consider whether or not they can think of any country or countries in the world where they are, the government, are the arbiters of what is acceptable speech and not acceptable speech. Can I begin to name a few? Do I need to start naming them? I'd have to get an atlas. Well, there's one behind me. I guess I could get it. But off the top of my head, China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba. What am I leaving? Oh, Saudi Arabia, Iran. What am I leaving out? I'm sure there's a dozen more. And if you don't believe that that is the case, all you have to do is just Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo, whatever your search engine is, social media score China. Read about it and understand that that is the glide path for all you pilots out there. That is the glide path that we are now on, and that we are just, boom, heading right into, because people are wanting to live in a world, or at least in this country, they're wanting to live in a society where nobody's ever offended. Now, we've already taken one step toward that, because we already have. Now, think about the European Union. The EU has actually outlawed hate speech. Now, my guess is the first 10 minutes of this podcast in the European Union could quite possibly fall within the category of hate speech. I've used the word queer and tranny. I don't know. I truly don't know. If it can happen in the European Union, and you look at what progressives and Democrats are doing in this country, don't you dare try to convince me that we could never have that, we would never allow that to happen in the United States of America. Because after all, we've got what? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. For those of you that are not following along, that is quite commonly referred to as the First Amendment, free speech. I'm not really sure. I truly am not sure whether or not we still live in a society where these 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, is applicable. Let's take the little troll on Twitter. He's all now, and again, the caveat. I know that Twitter is a private company. It sets its own terms of service. But, and I want to go down a little rabbit hole for just a minute. I got to make a note to myself before I get back to the Bill of Rights. I want to go down this rabbit hole for just a moment regarding Twitter and it being a private company setting its own terms of service. You may or may not be aware of the Communications Decency Act. The CDA set forth that there would be protection for publishers that use the internet. So that if a publisher or a platform like Twitter, someone put something defamatory up there, my cause of action, if somebody said something defamatory, libelous or slanderous about me on Twitter, my cause of action, my legal remedy, would not be against Twitter because Twitter is protected under the Communications Decency Act. My cause of action, if I could so identify the person who defamed me on Twitter, my cause of action, my legal remedy, would be against that individual. But the question then, and I know this is a question that if you really want to study this, it is all over the place about whether or not the First Amendment should apply to these platforms. Because I maintain that Twitter is not a publisher, Twitter is a platform. And as a platform, it is simply offering a service. And so as offering this service for me to go on and express my thoughts, to post recipes, to post pictures of bunny rabbits, Twitter is protected from anything that I may do that is considered defamatory, libelous or slanderous, or somehow violating some law somewhere. And the people that would be enforcing that against me would come against me and not Twitter. That's because of the Communications Decency Act. Now, the question then becomes, coming back out of the rabbit hole, should or should not the First Amendment apply to platforms like Twitter? That then raises a plethora of issues about antitrust. Have these platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, all become so dominant that they are blocking competition and keeping out competition, so they become anti-competitive, so that they have erected barriers of entry to anybody else that wants to create one of these platforms? Should they or should they not either be broken up or regulated or anything else? I can tell you, without going into the details, that while I believe that they have become anti-competitive, that they perhaps are violating the antitrust laws of the United States, that doesn't necessarily mean that I want the government to break them up or that I want the government to step in and regulate them. I would hope that there's enough competition in the age of the internet that somebody somewhere will come up with a different platform, because we know these things change in the wink of an eye, and there's always something new. And if you don't believe me, if you have rugrats at home, go ask them, hey, what social media platforms do you use? And ask them if they use Facebook. They're going to laugh at you. Or do you, particularly if they're 13 or 14 years old, do you use Twitter? They may even ask, what's a Twitter? Because they've moved on to something else. They've moved on to Snapchat, for example. So things continue to move and evolve at an unprecedented pace, at an unprecedented speed. So I totally get that Twitter is a private organization that can set its own terms of service, and the courts, because there will be litigation and there will be legislation about whether to break them up, whether to regulate them, and there are cases that are going to the U.S. Supreme Court about whether or not these platforms are subject to the First Amendment. I don't know. I just don't know. But here's what I do know. What I do know is that as a society, we have reached the stage where we are so scared of our own shadows that we're scared. Am I using the right word? Is this an acceptable word? Well, if I say this, is it going to offend anybody? If you live like that, your life must truly be miserable. It goes back to my point that I've said 1,000 times on radio, and I'll say it 1,000 times on this podcast. When you reach the stage or the point, when you have the epiphany in your life that you don't give a rat's ass about what anybody thinks or says about you, with maybe the exception of your parents, your spouse, your children, and maybe your best friend. And even at times, and I'm thinking of some of my best friends, I might be a little hurt if some of my best friends said something nasty about me, but I would certainly go to them and say, why the hell did you say that? What's this about? I don't care. And do you know what? You should look at me, if for no other reason, that as an example of somebody who a decade ago was in the mud pit. As my lawyer told me yesterday, we were at 0. On a scale of 0 to 10, we were at a 0. The media hated me. The administration hated me. Congress hated me. Everybody in the world hated me. Keith Olbermann's worst person in the world. It was awful. But I had an epiphany. And the epiphany was, I don't care. Was it easy? No. Was it a struggle? Of course. But it brought me to where I am today. And that is where I'm able to speak freely and openly. And if I offend somebody, well, I might feel sorry for you, but feeling sorry for you and not caring that it offended you are two entirely different things. Because I might feel sorry for you because if you are like the little troll on Twitter who's all upset that my friend @GayPatriot used the word tranny, and he feels like he has to go get him silenced for using that word, what a pathetic life. If you are so offended by what somebody says on Twitter, because you don't even know if they're real people or not real people, I make it very clear I'm a real person on Twitter. If you have to go get somebody suspended and that makes you feel good, I'd say you've got bigger problems than somebody using the word tranny. But let me get to what I think is the bigger problem. And the bigger problem is we've reached a stage in this country where we are so afraid, and this is a direct result of identity politics, When you start taking people away from the category of simply being a human being, you are a male or a female. You are one of the three races. And you now start putting people in every conceivable bucket that you can find and put a label on that bucket. You have created identity politics so that everybody can claim, oh, but the other bucket offended me and now I'm a victim. And we're becoming a nation of victims. And you know what? That is unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. And the reason it's unacceptable is this. If we now live in a society where everybody's in a little bucket with a little label on it, and we have to go around living our lives in fear of offending or tipping over somebody else's bucket, then you know what that does to you? That constrains you so that you cannot live your life fully. Now, I read a story yesterday. In fact, I've got it over here in my stack somewhere, in my POS, my pile of stuff. A story, and the headline was, and pardon me, here's the magic of a podcast. You know what I can do right now? I can pause and find the story. And I found the story. It comes from the it comes from Bloomberg. And the headline is this: Mom was right. Politeness pays. Politeness goes a long way on the internet, so for heaven's sakes, don't write things like this. Quote, no offense, but your code is horrible and doesn't show any logic. Or, quote, this is a very poor object-oriented design. On the popular Q&A website Stack Exchange, people who ask questions are more likely to accept answers that are politely phrased according to an article in the June 2019 issue of MIS Quarterly by Sheng-Yang Lee of the University of Connecticut, Huaxi Ru of the University of Rochester, and Andrew Winston of the University of Texas at Austin. They write, the more impolite an answer is, the less likely it will be chosen as the best answer. One big exception is if the impolite answerer is perceived as a true expert. In that case, they find, the question asker will find the impoliteness to be less of a concern or even as a signal of authority. Mom was right. Just because I say that you shouldn't care what people think about you doesn't mean that you have to be an a-hole to everybody. It simply means that you can be snarky, you can be a smartass, you can be a little maybe unconventional in the way you respond to people on Twitter or some other place. But if you go around living your life in fear of what other people are going to say or write or do, or if you yourself, whether you are on Facebook or Twitter, or it's in the company, or it's at school, university, wherever it might be, work, whatever, and you walk around in fear that either you're going to offend somebody or that you're going to be offended, you're not living life to the fullest. And that is a miserable way to live. In this country, it is truly a part of, at least I thought it was, a part of our culture that sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never harm you. But we're losing that. We are losing the capacity to take the slings and arrows of everyday life. And at the same time that we're losing that capacity to take those slings and arrows, those of the politically, the liberal fascists within our country want to make it so that you are afraid to say anything. And once the culture, now remember I have said, and it is unequivocally true, that politics trails the culture. Culture leads the politics. If the culture is such that we are going to live in a society where people are afraid to speak their mind, or certain words or phrases or language is unacceptable, considered hate speech, and in the culture it gets banned, that is just a small leap from the culture doing it to the politics doing it. End of rant. But just because it's the end of the rant doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop and seriously consider, are we part of the problem? I know if you read and in fact, I would encourage you. I don't know how much more I will have tweeted by the time you listen to this podcast. But if you go to my Twitter feed, at Michael Brown USA, you will see that generally I think, and maybe it's all in the eye of the beholder, I think I am sometimes funny. I know that most of the time I'm a smartass and that I'm snarky. And oftentimes I will mock the ignorance and the stupidity that I see on these platforms. I consider it a civic duty to do that. But I would just ask you to think about how we as a society are falling into this trap of we want to live in a safe cocoon. And that leads me to the next point that I wanted to make. I tweeted out yesterday something to the effect. In fact, well, let me just see if I can find it because I've got my Twitter feed open here. So yesterday I tweeted, all these rights are just getting in the way of making life safer and comfortable. I think it's time we repeal free speech, freedom of religion, the right to assemble, the right to petition government, freedom from unreasonable searches. Let's make America safe again. And then in parentheses, ugh, I'm just sick of Twitter today. But here's my point. Living in a free and open society is not an easy task. Living in an authoritarian society is even worse. In a free and open society, we will be offended. We have to recognize that some people are going to say and do things that make us uncomfortable. We have to recognize that in terms of, say, freedom of religion, that as long as that religion does not violate laws like, female genital mutilation, as much as we may dislike or disagree with that religion, we recognize the right of people to exercise that religion. We recognize in this country that we have a right to assemble. Now, we've already started putting limitations on the right to assemble. Oh, if you want to protest, well, you have to go over here and do it in this little box. I think many of those laws are unreasonable. But I also think that in a modern society that if your protest is so large that you're going to spill out onto an interstate highway and you're going to become a danger to yourself and to others, then I think those limitations are appropriate. What about the right to be free from unreasonable searches? Wouldn't it just be easier if the cops could just go in and just, we suspect that old Michael Brown's doing something illegal in his home, and why don't we just go in and just bust in the door and find out what he's doing? Because you and I know without a doubt that somewhere in your neighborhood or a neighborhood that you're familiar with in your community, in your city, that there's a meth house. Or we had a big pot bust in Colorado. We've legalized pot, but there's still a black market. Oh, cops are beating their chest. We had a big ass drug bust. Wouldn't it be easier instead of the cops? I mean, cops have a difficult job, right? So why don't we just make it easier? If you suspicion something, you think there's something illegal going on, why wait for a search warrant? Because by the time you get the search warrant, somebody might actually run away, escape, and you'll never be able to catch them. And now we've got a criminal getting away with a crime. Think about this one. I love this one. I think it's time to do away with the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Because I know what you think. And sometimes I think it too. Every time somebody takes the witness stand, or every time somebody appears in front of Congress and says something to this effect, well, Senator Muckety Muck, Well, Your Honor, on the advice of counsel, I have been instructed that my answer may incriminate me, so I'm invoking my right against self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. And bam, what do you immediately think? Guilty. I know it. Wouldn't it just be easier if we just forced everybody to testify, even if it incriminated you? And then we wouldn't have to go through this charade, right? Let's just get rid of these pesky amendments. Let's just, in fact, if we would just give more control to the government and just let the government start telling us what to do, what to say, what not to say, where to go, what not to do. I mean, just let them have utter control over our lives. It would be so much easier. It would be so much safer. Except you and I know history, and we know it never works out that way. But that's the path we're on. We're on the path where people don't like living in liberty. They don't like living in freedom. And I think social media is making that worse. And I think the liberal fascists are making that worse. The more we throw people into buckets for identity politics, the easier it is for the government to divide us. And the more they divide us into all these little buckets, the easier it is for government to gain control. And they do it ever so slightly. Remember the definition of progressivism? They just do it a little bit here and a little bit there. Something bad happens and somebody screams, oh, there ought to be a law. And then, unfortunately, some dumbass congressman or state legislator or a city councilman or a county commissioner hears, oh, we just heard Michael Brown scream, there ought to be a law. There ought to be a law. He's right. So they write a law and they get it passed, and there's one more law in the books that makes some everyday activity criminal, and you're not even aware of it, and we all become criminals. And the government extends their intrusive little fingers into every little aspect of our lives, and then one day we wake up and we realize, yeah, the pot was nice and lukewarm, and it was like a really comfortable bath, and we all felt so good, and we put some bubbles in, and we're scrubbing, and oh man, we invited our friends in, and next thing you know, it's this little orgy in the bathtub, and then all of a sudden it's boiling water. And then we wake up and we go, how the hell did that happen? How the hell did that happen? Well, let me give you an example of how it happens. Going back to Twitter again yesterday. The former governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper, who is now running for president, and he's one of 24. I know, I think it's actually 267, but somebody told me it was 24. 24 Democrats running on the Democrat ticket trying to become president. John Hickenlooper doesn't have a chance in hell. So all John Hickenlooper is doing is trying to position himself for one of two things. Well, one of three things. Because he's a guy that once he left his job as a geologist has lived on the government teat for the past couple of decades. And now that he's been term limited out of being the governor of Colorado, well, he's looking for a new government job. Even though he's worth millions of dollars, he's now looking for a new government job. So what he's really doing by running for president is he's angling to become the vice presidential nominee, or he's angling for a cabinet position, or he's just trying to up his price for the speaking circuit post-2020 election. That's what he's doing. But John Hickenlooper, a guy who's been the mayor of the city and county of Denver, the mayor of Denver, who has been the governor of Colorado, you would think would know better than to tweet something as stupid as this. In this country, he tweeted, before you can drive a car, you have to get a license and demonstrate you can responsibly drive that vehicle. I believe we should create that same rite of passage for gun ownership. Now, do I have to ask, what's wrong with that tweet? What's wrong with that? In this country, before you can drive a car, you have to get a license and demonstrate you can responsibly drive that vehicle. I believe we should create that same rite of passage for gun ownership. Well, let me start. Can I just start dissecting it? Well, I guess I can because it's my podcast, right? Let's first and foremost think about driving a car. Now, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of driving is a privilege because I am libertarian enough that I have never believed that driving is a privilege. I believe that driving, just as the right to assemble and the right to travel is a right, I do not believe that I should have to get a license to travel from point A to point B, whether that be by airplane, motorcycle, bicycle, or a car. But we have been taught to believe, and we have just learned to accept over time, that driving is a privilege. And so we have to go down to the DMV, to a bunch of bureaucrats that are just sitting there. They don't give a rat's ass. They don't care whether they issue one driver's license or 5,000 driver's licenses in a day. They don't care. They're just there because they're going to just, did you pass the test? What's your gender? You're male, or you look like a female, or vice versa. And then, look in here. Let's take your picture. Blah, 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 blah. I hate it. I absolutely hate it. But here's the deal. The deal is, if we accept that driving is a privilege, the right to keep and bear arms is not. Yes, for those of you who've listened to me, you know what that sound is. That's the Constitution. A well-regulated militia, reads Amendment number 2, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I don't think that the former governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper, understands the distinction between a privilege, driving a car, and a right. But he has one objective, and that is to play to his ignorant, uninformed base, or to the ignorant, uninformed people that go, well, yeah, that's right. I mean, if you're going to drive a car, you got to get a driver's license, so if you're going to get a gun, you ought to get a gun license. Really? Because the founders believed that in order to guarantee that we did not live under tyranny, that you and I, as affirmed by Justice Scalia in the Heller decision, that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. It is not a privilege. But let's just, for the sake of argument, let's just take John Hickenlooper's dumbass tweet for a moment, shall we? If in this country, he wrote, before you can drive a car, you have to get a license and demonstrate you can responsibly drive that vehicle. I believe we should create that same rite of passage for gun ownership. Have you thought about how many people how many people you know that have driver's licenses? How many of those people have either caused an accident that resulted in bodily injury, or that resulted in the death of someone, or possessing a valid driver's license, got behind the wheel of a car drunk and killed somebody? Or as we recently saw in Colorado, for those of you who don't know the story, we had an immigrant from Cuba. I think he's here legally. I think he has a green card. But whether he was trained properly or not to drive an 18-wheeler in the mountains of Colorado, I don't think so. He drives down I-70 eastbound. His brakes are smoking like crazy. His brakes have gone out. He passes one, if not two, runaway truck ramps, goes all the way down the mountain at a high speed in an 18-wheeler, out of control, kills, I think, at least 4 people, maybe more. I forget how many were injured. And so damages Interstate 70, a major thoroughfare, not just in Colorado, but a major thoroughfare for all sorts of traffic going from the East Coast to the West Coast, and shuts it down. Shuts it down completely because of all the damage. I'd bet you $1 he had a commercial driver's license. Didn't stop him from causing damage. But then, even worse, Governor Hickenlooper can't stop. And then he tweets this. Most hunters go through hunter safety classes to get a hunting license. So it reasons we should expect this practice across guns, which are even more potentially dangerous than a hunting rifle. Guns are even more potentially dangerous than a hunting rifle. Has he ever seen, do you think the governor's ever seen a GSW, a gunshot wound to the abdomen or the face or the head of someone who's a murder victim where the killer used a 10-gauge shotgun versus even that's pretty nasty, versus even a 44 mag revolver or a 9mm? So it reasons, he says, we should expand this practice across guns which are even more potentially dangerous than a hunting rifle. What's the other problem with that tweet? The other problem is quite simple and should be quite obvious to anybody. Every gun, I don't care whether it's a 22 or it's that 10 gauge. I don't care whether it's a revolver, a semi-automatic, or an automatic. I don't care what the caliber is. Every gun is dangerous if used improperly or if used by a criminal. And yes, a gun is even dangerous if I use it in the protection of my home or business or for my own life, because somebody's going to die. And if I use my gun properly, it's not going to be me, it's going to be the thug. This is what I mean when I say, I don't know that, and I would love for Gallup or Ipsos or somebody to do a poll. Or I would love for some PhD student to study this. But I'm afraid, I am truly afraid, that we have reached the stage in this country where people are clamoring for more government control. Because the more government control that we can get over our lives, at least their thinking goes, the easier life will be. We'll be safer. We won't have to worry about bad things. We won't have to worry about criminals. We won't have to worry about being offended. There are just so many things, their thinking is, that we wouldn't have to worry about if we just had more government intrusion. Now, you and I know that that is utter insanity, that those who live in tyranny look through the bars of that tyrannical government, and they look at the freedoms that we still have, that we're still barely hanging on to. A republic, madam, if you can keep it, said Dr. Franklin. They look at us, and they are green with envy. They all want to come here because we have liberty, and we have freedom, and we have free markets. But too many dumbasses in this country want what they have. It's the old, the grass is greener on the other side. Well, it's not for me, and I hope it's not for you. The grass is green here. Oh, we got brown spots. Oh, can I say that, or is that somehow politically incorrect? We've got brown spots in the grass, and we either need to replace the turf or put some fertilizer on it or do something. And if we don't, the entire yard's going to be brown. Michael Brown's racist. He talked about brown yards or something. See how stupid it is? That's exactly how stupid we are now. So I want you to think about it. Do you want to live in liberty and all of the troubles that come with liberty, or do you want to live in tyranny? If you want to live in tyranny, if you truly do, I'll start a GoFundMe, and I'll buy you a one-way. I'm not going to waste money on a first-class ticket. I'll buy you a one-way ticket to Venezuela. I'll buy you a one-way ticket to China. I'll buy you a one-way ticket to Moscow. I'll buy you a one-way ticket to Havana. And then you can send me an email after about a year, and you can tell me how that's working out for you. Ask yourselves, truly ask yourselves, do you want to live in liberty? Do you want to live in freedom? Or are you getting so uncomfortable? Are you getting so nervous about all of these things happening around you? Are you so afraid that you're going to say something or somebody's going to say something to you that we just need to get more control over our lives? Because if you think that, you need to really, truly reevaluate what you think and know about history. I think that one of the reasons why we're kind of descending into this mentality that, it's just too much trouble to live in freedom is because the Fourth Estate, the freedom of the press, has really devolved not into the Fourth Estate, but it has devolved into a mouthpiece for the liberal fascists who really do want to take us down this path of progressivism toward tyranny. Now, let me make it abundantly clear. I don't think that tyranny, well, I do believe it's in the driveway. I don't think in some cases it's rung the doorbell. It's not in the front door yet. Yeah, maybe I'll take that back. In some places, yeah, I think tyranny actually is inside the house. That it's already stepped inside the doorway. But I do want us to consider that part of the reason we have gotten to this stage is because the media has simply become the mouthpiece of those who oppose what you and I believe in terms of individual liberty, free markets, all the things that the founding fathers used to establish this country. I don't know whether you remember, but there was this huge outcry when Kevin Williamson, he's a putative conservative commentator, was hired as a contributor to the Atlantic magazine. Well, the outcry was so loud that he was fired about 12 minutes later because his viewpoints, his pseudo-conservative viewpoints were considered to be overly provocative. Now imagine, you go through, it would be like somebody hiring me. They hire me, and they've never listened to the radio program. They've never looked at my social media accounts. They've never listened to the podcast, and they hire me to do something. And then suddenly they turn around 12 minutes later because, well, we hired you. Here's your key card. Here's your health card, and here's your little cubicle or your office space. Then they go back to their office, and they listen to this podcast, this particular episode of the podcast. And after about 20 minutes, they come back and they go, I think we made a mistake. My point is this. Yesterday, it was announced that former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emmanuel would be taking the role of a contributing editor at the very same magazine, The Atlantic, and he'll also be joining ABC News as an on-air contributor. Now, I want to give you a quick reminder of exactly who Rahm Emmanuel is and why this is not good news from the big media. Besides the fact that Emmanuel has been a mercenary politician his entire adult life, which, in my opinion, that should be disqualifying on its face, he should at the very least be blackballed from media gigs for his unrepentant and habitual violations of Illinois' Freedom of Information Act. Under his leadership, city government was notorious for stonewalling public records requests from news outlets, from activists, and most notably in the 2014 fatal police shooting of that 17-year-old Laquan McDonald by the Chicago Popo. The police dash cam video completely contradicted the cop's narrative that McDonald had lunged at an officer with a knife. But Rahm Emanuel's mayoral administration sat on the footage for more than a year. And I point out that it was more than a year because it was an election year, as it happens. And of course, the excuse was, well, there's an ongoing investigation. Now, the city of Chicago, meaning the taxpayers, settled with McDonald's family for $5 million. But part of that agreement, part of that settlement, forbid the family from releasing the tape until the so-called investigation was complete. And then the mayor only released the video after it lost a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit brought by an independent journalist who was later barred from the press conference where the video was first shown. Let me repeat that. An independent journalist sued to get release of the videotape. He won. Then he was barred by the mayor, Rahm Emanuel, from attending the press conference where the video was first shown. Now, Rahm Emanuel is going to be a commentator for The Atlantic magazine, and he's going to be a commentator and a talking head for ABC News. Your Honor, I rest my case. This is exactly why. Let me just be blunt. If you watch ABC Evening News, and let me just not pick on ABC. If you watch NBC, you watch CBS, I don't care if you watch Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, Bloomberg, CNBC, I don't care what you watch. If you watch it and you just allow all of that information by osmosis to go into your brain with no critical thinking, let me tell you something that I would say to your face if you told me, yeah, Michael, I just sit and I just watch the news and I don't really think about it. Well, you know what I would say to your face? You're part of the problem. Rahm Emanuel's administration was an absolute disgrace to freedom of information. He was no friend to Chicago media. The fight over that tape was only the most high-profile instance of Chicago dragging its feet on these open records requests. Back in 2015, an Illinois judge, in response to a Chicago Tribune lawsuit, a suit that claimed that Emmanuel's office illegally withheld emails and texts from his private devices. Oh, you mean like Hillary, who worked for Obama at the same time that Rahm Emanuel worked for? Yeah, those people. They seem to have something about conducting government business on private servers. But let me ask you, how many of them have been charged with a crime? How many of them have been charged with either collusion or obstruction? Oh, I can wait. Yeah, it's a podcast. I can just put it on pause and just wait for you to respond. I just want you to know this. To me, this is a great example of what I mean about how the media is a serious part of the problem. A serious part of the problem. And if you just allow the media to fill your brain and you don't do any critical thinking or research on your own, you truly are part of the problem. And trust is in the mainstream media. I'd like to find a different term for mainstream media. Trust is at an all-time low. There was a Monmouth University poll back in 2018 that found that 77% of the public believe that major news outlets report fake news. That's a sharp rise from 63% who felt that way in 2017. Then there was an Axios poll in 2018 that found that 92% of conservatives believe the media intentionally reports fake news. And I think a good example of this fakeness is all the reporting on climate change. The dire predictions of an ice-free Arctic have remained popular on the climate fear-mongering circuit, owing to the psychological currency of things melting, and not least the emotional relevance applicable to the fate of the Arctic's most famous resident, those polar bears. So we have been told, for example, that Arctic sea ice is gone in the summer within 5 years. Arctic summers ice-free by 2013. Hang on a minute. Oh, yeah, that's 6 years ago. Then this story from 2007 in the Star News. It's an AP story by a reporter that I actually know, Seth Borenstein. Could all Arctic ice be gone by 2012? Well, apparently not. Here's what he wrote. Now, here's an example of what I mean of I can know somebody and be diametrically opposed to their political views, and I can be diametrically opposed or believe that their reporting is just awful, but still consider them to be, Seth's he's a nice enough guy. He's the kind of guy that I'd go have to some dive Mexican place and have a margarita with. We just couldn't talk climate science. We couldn't talk politics. Here's what he wrote back in 2007. An already relentless melting of the Arctic greatly accelerated this summer, a warning sign that some scientists worry could mean global warming has passed an ominous tipping point. One even speculated that summer sea ice would be gone in 5 years, 2012. Greenland's ice sheet melted nearly 19 billion tons more than the previous high mark, and data obtained by the Associated Press. The Arctic is screaming, said Mark Cerise, a senior scientist at the government Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. We should go up to the government Snow and Ice Center in Boulder, Colorado, and ask them, hey, just how much snow and ice did you get at the end of the month? For those of you who don't live in Colorado, we're experiencing horrible global warming. Yeah, 10 inches of snow on my deck. But my point about all of this is, clearly, the media doesn't care. The media is about finding the narrative, pushing the narrative, and then there is actually there's no embarrassment. If we were to go back to Seth Borenstein today and say, hey, you know that article you wrote on December 12, 2007, with the headline screaming, could all Arctic ice be gone by 2012? He'd shrug his shoulders and just say, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. It's just taking longer. You know that's the answer. They're never going to accept that the climate does change. Arctic sea ice comes and goes. Sea levels rise and fall. It is what it is. Here are some more of the headlines just to prove my point. This comes from the Argus Press, June 24, 2008. NASA scientist, quote, we're toast. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years, meaning if this is 2008, that means 2013 to 2018, the Arctic will be free of ice in the summer. Well, turns out that's not true. New Scientist, Daily News, April 2008, North Pole could be ice-free in 2008. Al Gore, polar ice cap may disappear by summer of 2014. Do you get the point? The point is they latch on to a narrative, and then they just pound the narrative into our heads day after day after day. And if you don't critically think about this, if you don't stop and realize, good grief, I'm seeing and hearing the same talking points in every freaking story I read or hear on the news. Maybe I should check this out myself. Live Science, April 12, 2013. Say goodbye to Arctic summer ice. Why Arctic sea ice will vanish in 2013. Sierra Club of Nevada. Earth Insight. Ice-free Arctic in 2 years. What's the date on this one? I don't see the date. Oh, here it is, 2013. So by 2015, 4 years ago, ice-free Arctic. It goes on and on and on. My point being, don't just be one of these people that just never thinks critically about what you're being spoon-fed. Stop and think. Think for yourselves. Learn to analyze. Learn to question. And in fact, I would say that we are now living in an age, and this is particularly true of social media. Question everything. I thought that's what us old baby boomers used to say when we were hippies. Question everything. Question authority. And it seems we've lost all of that idealism. And now it's like, give us authority and don't question anything. We've completely lost our way. and those generations behind us? I didn't read the story, so you can accuse me right here of not being a discerning consumer of the news. I only read the headline. I didn't read the story because, well, the headline was Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, and I am an Apple aficionado, as most of you know, gave a graduation speech in which he said, we've either done a disservice or we have failed all of the generations behind us. No, we haven't. We have not failed all the generations behind us. We have failed ourselves. This generation, baby boomers, we are not standing up, we are not taking a stand, and we are not saying to those behind us, watch what you wish for, because you may get it and you'll regret it. And at that, let's do a couple of taxpayer relief shots, because sometimes people do get what they deserve. A 73-year-old jitney driver fatally shoots a passenger during a robbery attempt. This comes to us from Duquesne, Pennsylvania, courtesy of television station KDKA.
Shot and killed when police say he tried to rob a jitney driver in Duquesne this afternoon. Police say both men had guns and the driver fired first. Ralph Iannotti's live at Allegheny County Police Headquarters with more. Ralph.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ken. A robbery attempt backfired late this afternoon, and it turned deadly. Allegheny County Police said the shooting happened around 4 o'clock in an alley near South 6th Street in the city of Duquesne. A jitney driver in his 70s picked up a 33-year-old man along with another passenger. While the man was driving, the 33-year-old passenger demanded money and struck him in the head with a gun. The second passenger jumped out of the car and ran off. The jitney driver and the 33-year-old got out of the vehicle, and the taxi driver pulled out his own gun and shot the would-be robber, killing him. Investigators said the jitney driver had a legally owned gun and had a valid concealed permit to carry a firearm. At this time, no charges have been filed in the investigation. And as of late tonight, no word from the Allegheny County medical examiner as to the identity of the dead man. We're live.
Wow. 70. Okay, all of you out there, all of you young thugs out there, you 30-something thugs that think you can just rob a 73-year-old jitney driver. Who uses the term jitney? I haven't heard jitney used in a long time. That's I don't. Is that just unique to Pennsylvania? I don't know. A jitney driver. So the 73-year-old man gets hit on the head. The passengers are trying to rob him. He jumps out, pulls his own gun, and shoots the thug. That is a classic taxpayer relief shot. That is a classic example of the proper use of self-defense. And I say good for the old man, because I don't know anything about the old man. But a 73-year-old guy driving a jitney, probably trying to supplement his Social Security, and some a-hole wants to rob him, and rob him by hitting him on the back of the head and then pulling a gun on him. Some of you may think this sounds crass or cruel, but I think that 33-year-old thug got exactly what he deserved. A suspected armed robber was shot dead on SMU Boulevard, that's in Dallas, Texas, according to the Popo.
Right, Demetria, thank you. Well, this no doubt rattled some students last night. A man with a gun broke into another man's apartment near the SMU campus. Police say both men had guns, but only one of them is alive this morning. This all happened at the Mockingbird Flats late last night, and we've been gathering more information since then. Our Chris Sadeghi is live this morning, in fact, with more on this. Chris, what have we learned?
Well, Jason, this is one of those developments where you have apartments above businesses and restaurants, so there's a lot of people coming and going, and police say that last night there was an attempted robbery in the apartments, but it was the suspected robber who ended up dead. It started around 9 o'clock last night. We talked to an employee at the Barley House, which is right next door. She told us she saw a bunch of people come running out of the Mockingbird Flats apartments and several police cars pull up with and officers with rifles run in. According to Dallas police, there was an armed robbery attempt just outside of an apartment door, but the suspected victim had a handgun, and it led to an exchange of gunfire. Police say the would-be robber is dead, and the would-be robbery victim was also shot in the exchange. We spoke to a woman who lives here, and she said they received an email recently warning them about a robbery that happened in the area, and that with businesses in the same building, it can be hard to tell who belongs and who doesn't.
And I think apartment security could be better, not just retail, because there are people that don't even live here that are parking it next to the garage. So I think if there was more of like a pinpoint code inside versus just a key fob.
And we're told the suspected robbery victim was taken to Baylor University Medical Center and that he did undergo surgery. So far, we don't have an update on his condition. Jason.
Again, a good guy with a gun, protecting his own life and protecting his property. This is why we do the taxpayer relief shots. These are classic examples of where, Tamara and I are watching I'm not going to mention the series because then it'll distract you from the point that I want to make, but we're watching a series, and it has to do with some West Texas oil men and ranchers. And I thought just the other night as I was watching, as they were going to a meeting, they were both strapping on their 6-shooters. And I thought, there really is some truth that when you don't know who's armed or not armed, or if you can safely assume that everybody is carrying a weapon, society tends to be a lot more polite. Society tends to be probably a little more safer. And at some point, the thugs get the message, you can't just willy-nilly go around robbing people. That's why we do taxpayer relief shots. This next taxpayer relief shot comes to us from Kentucky.
A homeowner fights back after an intruder breaks in with a rifle.
Reporter Joylyn Bukovac is here with a look at how the events unfolded earlier today in Davis County.
An absolutely terrifying morning for one tri-state homeowner. Investigators tell me an intruder broke into this home not once, but twice. And that's when the homeowner took matters into his own hands. An intruder allegedly forced his way into this home by kicking in the door around 8 o'clock Tuesday morning. Kenneth Collins, the homeowner, convinced the intruder to leave, but he didn't stay away for very long.
When he came back the second time, he was armed with an AR-15. So certainly Mr. Collins feared for his life.
That's when the homeowner took matters into his own hands, shooting the intruder twice, once in the chest and once in the lower back. Davis County Sheriff's detectives tell me the intruder, Charles Jean Jr., was inside Collins' home when he was shot.
You really don't need to hear anything else about that taxpayer relief shot. The homeowner, somebody breaks into your house, you convince them to leave. Now, I'm going to make a big-ass assumption here that he did call 911 between the time the intruder came into his home the first time and the second time. But the second time, the stupid intruder comes in with an AR-15, yeah, you're going to get shot. You're going to end up dead right there. Again, a classic example of why I want you to hear these taxpayer relief shots, because it can happen to you. And I don't care whether you use a gun or a baseball bat or a golf club, but I just want you to think about your role in defending yourself. Because everybody thinks, going back to the entirety of this first part of this podcast, about how there are so many people that believe that somehow the government's going to protect us from things that offend us, that bother us, that hurt us, or whatever. You know what? Unless you just happen to be 1 in 1 million, that when you dial 911, the cop is already in your driveway. That's not going to happen. The cops, as the saying goes, are minutes away when seconds count. And it's not the fault of the popo. It's not the fault of the cops. But until we learn, until we understand that we have a responsibility to defend and protect ourselves, you know what? the more we don't put out there that we can and we will exercise these God-given natural rights of self-defense, that creates a vacuum that allows dumbasses like John Hickenlooper to say, yeah, not everybody needs a gun. Well, unless you're getting broke into, and then you're going to wish you had a gun. And last but not least, Democrat ideas are not awful at a merely superficial level. Democrat ideas will wreck the system of government that was laid out in the Constitution. The system of government that we have under our Constitution is the most stable system the world has seen over the past 2 or 3 centuries. But the Democrats are serious about destroying the Electoral College, which establishes a balance of power between urban and rural parts of the country. That the Electoral College allows even states with small populations to have a say in how this country is run. You know, Pete Buttigieg was in either in Vermont or New Hampshire, I think, after he did his Fox Town Hall. Do you think if there wasn't an Electoral College, if you think that there was just this national popular vote, do you think that Pete Buttigieg, however you pronounce his name, that he's going to spend any time in Vermont or New Hampshire? Of course not. Well, yesterday, Democrats pushed a national popular vote like they did in Colorado through the Nevada Senate. Assembly Bill 186, which passed the Senate on a 12-8 vote, would bring Nevada into the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Now, that's an agreement between participating states that says they will cast their electoral votes for the winner of the popular vote. Now, the problem is we don't really have a popular vote, so what they're really saying is we're not going to cast our ballots, our votes, so you and I are going to go to our precincts, our polling places. We're going to vote. In Colorado, for example, because we've entered into this stupid compact, we're going to go to our polling place and we're going to vote. But then Colorado is not going to cast its votes until it sees how the popular vote goes, the national vote goes. It's almost like we're waiting for California and New York to tell us how to vote. Anyway, back to the story. If signed as expected by Democrat Governor Steve Sisolak, Nevada would become the 16th state to join the compact, along with 14 states and the District of Columbia. Now, here's my concern. If critical mass is reached, the Electoral College would essentially be rendered null and void, and it would be so without a constitutional amendment or without the Congress putting anything in front of you and me. The Democrats support this because the Republican candidates won in 2000 and in 2016 while losing the popular vote. So their solution to this, what I consider to be a perceived problem, is effectively to disenfranchise flyover country. Big cities, you know, I've given you the list of like the filthiest cities, those top 20 filthy cities. They're characterized by corruption, excessive regulation, excessive taxation, widespread welfare dependence, cultural decay, high minority populations, and what? What's the common denominator that I've not mentioned? They're run by Democrats. The Democrat Party is the urban party. It does well in states with large urban areas. Look at California. Look at New York. And you should be scared. Look at Texas. Without the Electoral College, these would be the only states that matter. So far-left groups like Common Cause, Indivisible, and Public Citizen are cheering this Nevada vote. But it should give you an idea of just how pernicious it is. The bill allows California and New York to help themselves to Nevada's votes and to states like Colorado. Imagine an America in which people like Gavin Newsom or Andrew Cuomo are elected president every single time. The cold Civil War would heat up as quickly as people who don't live in densely populated blue states realize that they no longer have a vote and that they're being ruled, not governed, but ruled by Democrats from big cities and big states. Nevada, what happens in Vegas should stay in. You know what happens in Nevada should stay in Nevada. Colorado, Well, we've already screwed up. Hey, thanks for listening to the Michael Brown to Unplugged podcast. I appreciate you tuning in. We're up on iTunes now. So if you go to iTunes, you can subscribe there. And I would appreciate a subscription because that helps us with iTunes. And if you do subscribe on iTunes, while we are offering the proverbial check in the mail, if you leave us a 5-star review, a 5-star rating, and then if you would be so kind, and I know you're busy, but if you would leave us a review, write something nice, say something nice about the podcast. Yeah. If you're going to say something nasty about the podcast, well, don't write that. And then I need you to go to my website, michaelbrowntoday.com, michaelbrowntoday.com, because on that website, you'll find all of these social media platforms that I denigrated at the beginning of the podcast. You'll find where you can join me on Facebook. It's facebook.com/Michael D. Brown. If you like that page and then request to join the discussion group, you can do that there. Or on Twitter, if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, it's at Michael Brown USA. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/Michael Brown Today. And you can follow me on Instagram, which is Michael D. Brown. But you can get all of that in one stop. We provide one-stop shopping by going to michaelbrowntoday.com, and all of those social media icons are on the bottom. So I appreciate you guys listening to the podcast. Share it with your friends. Share it with somebody that you think it might irritate. Yeah, do that too. And I'll talk to you again tomorrow.